It was just another quiet evening in Newark, or so it seemed, the kind of night where the city felt like it was frozen in time. People moved through the streets with a routine calmness, unaware of the storm that was brewing just below the surface. The neon lights flickered on, casting an artificial glow across the sidewalks, while the hum of traffic created a comforting background noise for the late-night crowd. Some were headed home from long shifts at work. Others were making their way to the few bars still open in the area. Life went on, as it always did, without warning. But in the deepest corners of Newark, something far darker than the streets was beginning to stir. It started with the faintest whisper. At first, no one paid much attention. A few people reported feeling sick, a little under the weather, but nothing out of the ordinary. A cough here, a mild fever there. Just the usual seasonal illnesses people assumed. The city had been through worse, and it wasn't the first time the hospitals had been filled with flu cases. But this wasn't like the flu. Something about this sickness felt different, and nobody knew it yet. It was spreading faster than anyone could have predicted. Jason had been tending bar at Charlie's pub for years. He knew the regulars by name and could always predict when someone would need a refill before they even asked. The place was small but had a welcoming charm, and tonight, just like every other, it was bustling with the hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses. There was a light crowd for a Tuesday, but that was typical. The mix of locals and the occasional out-of-towner made it feel like home. A safe haven from the chaos of the outside world. He was just about to pour another round for the group of friends seated at the corner booth when the door swung open with a sharp creak, drawing his attention. Mark, his best friend since high school, stepped through the doorway. Jason immediately noticed something wasn't right. Mark was pale, his usual brown hair hanging messily around his face, as if he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, a sickly yellow hue surrounding the whites of his eyes, and his lips were dry, cracked like they hadn't seen water in hours. He didn't look like someone who had just come from a long shift or a rough day. He looked off, like he was barely hanging on to something. Something Jason couldn't quite put his finger on. "You look like death," Jason said, trying to lighten the mood as he grabbed a fresh glass to start filling it with beer. "What's going on, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark didn't respond. Instead, he shuffled to the bar with slow, deliberate steps. The way he moved made Jason's stomach churn a little. Mark had always been energetic, the kind of guy who would joke around and joke his way through even the worst situations. But now, there was nothing but a grim silence surrounding him. "Mark?" Jason tried again, his voice tinged with concern now. "Are you all right?" Mark's head jerked up, and for a moment, their eyes locked. But there was no recognition in Mark's gaze, only a hollow emptiness, like he wasn't really there at all. Jason froze, unsure of what to say. Mark's lips parted slightly as if he was about to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, he leaned forward and let out a low, guttural growl. Jason felt a chill creep up his spine. This wasn't the Mark he knew. This wasn't the guy who would have cracked a joke or given him shit for working late. This man, or whatever was left of him, was wrong. Before Jason could even make sense of what was happening, Mark lunged at him. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that Jason didn't even have time to react. One moment, his friend was standing in front of him, and the next, Mark was on top of him, his hands gripping Jason's arms with a strength that Jason hadn't known he was capable of. Jason struggled, pushing back against him, but Mark's grip only tightened, his fingers digging into the skin like a vice. Jason tried to shove him off, but Mark wasn't stopping. It was as if something had taken over him. His body moved with unnatural speed, his jaw snapping open with a sickening crack. In one brutal motion, Mark bit down hard on Jason's forearm. Pain exploded through Jason's body, searing him with agony. He let out a scream, the sound sharp and raw. But Mark didn't let go. His teeth were like knives, sinking deeper into Jason's flesh with each passing second. Blood poured from the wound, staining Jason's shirt, and he felt himself slipping. This wasn't just a bite. It wasn't just some drunken bar fight. There was something vicious, almost animalistic, in the way Mark was attacking him. Jason shoved harder, finally managing to break free, but the damage had already been done. He stumbled back, his mind spinning with confusion and terror. His arm burned where Mark had bitten him, and when he looked down, he could already see the blood turning an unnatural shade of blue. His heart hammered in his chest. Jason's thoughts were a chaotic blur as he tried to process what had just happened. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his body wasn't listening. He could feel the venom spreading through his veins, a cold, crawling sensation that seemed to wrap around his bones, choking him. He glanced around, hoping to see someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But the bar had fallen deathly silent. The few people who were still inside stared at him in disbelief, their faces pale with horror, their eyes wide with fear. But there was no time to ask for help. Jason felt his legs give out from under him, his body suddenly weak and uncooperative. He collapsed onto the floor, his vision blurring, everything around him turning dark. The last thing he heard was the distant sound of footsteps running toward him. "Jason! Jason!" someone shouted, but it was too late. The world around him faded into nothingness as his body went numb, and all he could do was wonder if he would ever wake up again. And that was just the beginning. The sun rose the next morning, casting an eerie orange glow over the city of Newark. The once bustling streets now felt deserted, save for a few scattered souls moving slowly in the early light. But there was something different in the air. A heavy tension, like the calm before a storm. Word had already spread, like wildfire, throughout the city about the strange outbreak, though nobody fully understood what was happening. People whispered about it in hushed voices, unsure whether it was a bad flu or something worse. News outlets, too, downplayed it as just another viral infection. They called it a strange flu, something that caused mild symptoms at first: fever, body aches, coughing. But anyone who had witnessed the horrors of the night before knew better. What they were seeing wasn't just sickness. It was something darker, something far more sinister. Jason awoke in a hospital bed, the bright lights above him making his head throb. His body felt like it had been hit by a truck, every muscle sore and aching, his mouth dry as sandpaper. He blinked several times, trying to clear his blurry vision, but his head swam with dizziness. He tried to push himself up, but winced as a sharp pain shot through his arm. He looked down at the wound, still raw, the skin swollen and turning an angry shade of blue. The bite mark from Mark the night before had spread its venom through his veins, and now it felt like it was crawling under his skin, poisoning him from the inside out. His heartbeat was erratic, and he could hear the faint sound of machines beeping, the rhythm steady and mechanical in the silence of the room. He turned his head to the side and saw the sterile hospital room around him. It looked like any other hospital room, yet there was an unsettling stillness that clung to the air. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shadows across the walls, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with something else, something sour, metallic. Jason tried to sit up again, but the dizziness was too much, and he slumped back into the bed, his eyes closing against the pounding pain in his skull. Then he heard it, moaning. At first, he thought it was a dream, his mind playing tricks on him. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, coming from the bed beside him. He turned his head with difficulty, focusing his bleary eyes on the figure next to him. A woman was lying in the bed, her back arched unnaturally, her hands twisted and contorted as if they no longer belonged to her. She muttered low, incomprehensible words, the sound coming from deep in her throat, as though she was trying to speak, but couldn't form proper sentences. Her once beautiful face was pale and gaunt, her eyes glazed over, with a faint, almost sickly yellow hue. Jason's heart skipped a beat. She looked like she was dying, but there was something off. Something that made him feel like the woman in the bed wasn't quite human anymore. He tried to call out to a nurse, but his voice came out in a weak rasp. "Hey, someone help her," he croaked, though the words barely left his mouth. He didn't know if anyone heard him, but he didn't have the strength to try again. A nurse walked into the room, her face marked with the fatigue of long shifts and long hours. She looked at the woman in the bed with a frown, her brow furrowed in confusion. She had been treating patients all night, but something about this woman's condition was different. Something wasn't right. The nurse moved closer, her hands reaching for the woman's wrist to check her vitals. But before she could do anything, the woman's head snapped up, her mouth opening wide, and in an instant, she lunged at the nurse with a speed that Jason couldn't even comprehend. It was like a wild animal attacking its prey, fast, violent, and merciless. The nurse screamed as the woman's teeth sank into her neck, blood spreading out in a thick stream, splattering against the walls. Jason couldn't move. He was frozen, his body too weak, too sick to do anything. He could only watch as the scene unfolded before him, his mind struggling to make sense of it. The nurse's screams were quickly cut off as her body went limp, her blood pooling on the floor. The woman, her face covered in crimson, looked up, her mouth dripping with the nurse's blood. She made eye contact with Jason. Then, in a blur of motion, the woman turned and darted toward Jason, her hands reaching out for him. Her fingers curled like claws, her mouth opening wide, and before he could react, she was on him. Panic surged through him, but his body was too weak. He felt the venom inside him, pulsing, spreading, making everything feel heavier and slower. He had no choice but to pull back, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't long before other nurses and doctors burst into the room, and chaos erupted. They tried to subdue the woman, shouting orders, but the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The woman fought like an animal, her strength seemingly endless as she fought off anyone who came close. The hospital, once a place of safety, was now a battleground. By the time the woman had been subdued, her body left lifeless on the floor. The damage had already been done. It wasn't just one woman. There were others. In the hallways, in other rooms, the same thing was happening. People, patients, nurses, doctors were turning, becoming mindless, violent creatures. Those who had been infected were spreading the virus faster than anyone could contain. It wasn't just the flu. It was something far worse. Something that turned people into rabid animals, driven only by bloodlust. Jason lay there, helpless, as he watched everything around him crumble. He had no idea what was happening, but it was clear now. Newark was falling apart, and the venom coursing through his veins was only the beginning. By noon, Newark's streets had transformed into a living nightmare. People were running through the streets, their eyes wild and bloodshot, gnashing their teeth, tearing through anyone they could catch. Stores were looted, cars abandoned, and everywhere Jason looked, he saw the same thing. The infected tearing apart their fellow citizens. There was no rhyme or reason to it. It was chaos, pure and simple. And it was spreading fast. The venom was infecting anyone who came into contact with it. Once bitten, once scratched, the virus moved faster than anything they had seen before. There was no time to react, no time to prepare. Newark wasn't just sick anymore. It was dying. And Jason was just one of many caught in the middle of it all, trying to survive long enough to figure out how to stop it, or if it was even possible to stop it at all. Jason's mind was clouded, his thoughts tangled in confusion and fear as he stumbled through the chaos that had overtaken Newark. The hospital was a distant memory now, a place of horror that he barely escaped from. His body was weak from the venom spreading through him, his arms still throbbing from the bite, and every step he took felt like it took everything out of him. He could barely stay upright. A weight of his own body felt like it was dragging him down into the pavement. His heart raced, not just from the fear of what had happened to him, but because he could feel something else, something dark and cold coursing through his veins, twisting his body, stealing his strength. The streets of Newark were unrecognizable. What had once been a bustling city, full of life, noise, and movement, now looked like a war zone. Cars were overturned, windows shattered, and the sounds of distant screams echoed through the air. The sky, once bright and clear, was now choked with smoke from burning buildings, a haze that made everything feel surreal, as if he were walking through a nightmare. Jason barely registered the shrieks of the undead as they stumbled through the streets, some of them dragging themselves with broken limbs, others sprinting with unnatural speed, their eyes wild with hunger. He couldn't focus on them. He had to focus on getting out, on surviving, on finding a way to keep going. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his vision swaying as he pushed himself forward, using the nearby buildings to steady himself. He had to escape. But escape to where? Newark was falling apart. There was nowhere safe. He heard a rustling sound behind him, a shift in the air, and without thinking he turned, raising his arms instinctively to shield himself. A shadow lunged toward him. It was a man. No, not a man anymore. The creature's face was twisted, pale skin stretched tightly over the bones, eyes sunken deep into its skull. It growled, a deep, guttural sound that made Jason's stomach churn with terror. Before the creature could reach him, a figure moved swiftly through the chaos, a blur of motion, and in one clean motion, the creature was knocked aside. Jason stumbled back, gasping for breath, his eyes wide as he looked up at the person who had saved him. A woman, tall and athletic, short-cropped, dark hair, and a determined look in her eyes. She didn't look like someone who had been broken by the chaos. She was still fighting, still alive, still willing to fight for survival. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. Jason didn't answer immediately. He just nodded, unsure if he could trust his voice to stay steady. He didn't feel okay. He felt sick, dizzy, and afraid. But there was something about this woman that made him feel like maybe, just maybe, He wasn't entirely alone in this nightmare. "Name's Sarah," she said, her eyes scanning the street as she moved back toward him. "You're lucky I was here. You don't want to be caught out here alone." Jason's mouth felt dry, but he managed to speak. "Jason," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "What's happening? What's going on?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She just looked at him, sizing him up for a moment. There was a hardness in her expression, a wariness that made him realize she wasn't just trying to survive this. She was used to surviving. "Does it matter now?" she said finally, her tone blunt. "We've all seen it. It's happening everywhere." Jason nodded, his mind reeling. He didn't need to ask what she meant. He had seen it too. Those things, the monsters that had once been people. The zombies, as the survivors were calling them. The creatures that had taken over Newark. "I need to keep moving," Sarah said, her voice growing tighter as she checked the area around them. "We need to get to safer ground. We can't stay out here for too long." Jason didn't hesitate. He pushed himself to his feet, the dizziness still making his legs weak, but he forced himself to keep up with Sarah. She was already moving with purpose, dodging between cars and wreckage, always keeping her eyes on the street ahead. As they turned a corner, Jason spotted two more people, a man and a woman, huddled together beside a broken-down van. The man was tall, with broad shoulders, dressed in a grease-stained mechanic's shirt. The woman had a soft, warm face, but her eyes were filled with the same fear that Jason had seen in so many others. "Hey, are you okay?" Sarah called out to them as they approached. "We're fine," the man said, though his voice lacked the conviction of someone who was truly okay. He glanced over at the woman, then back at Sarah. "Is it just us? We need to get out of the city." "Yeah, we need to move fast," Sarah said. "We're not the only ones trying to leave. The undead are everywhere, and we need to find a way out before it gets worse." The woman spoke up then, her voice quiet but steady. "We're Maya and Tony. We're just trying to survive like everyone else." Jason gave them a weak smile. "I'm Jason." Sarah nodded and motioned for them to follow her. "Stick together. We might be able to find something useful if we head to the old hardware store. Maybe we can find weapons, supplies, something to help us get out of this city." The group moved quickly, sticking close to the buildings and avoiding the open streets. Jason's mind was racing. He didn't know these people, but he had no choice but to trust them. They were all in the same situation. It wasn't about fighting anymore. It was about surviving. And if that meant sticking together, then that's what they would do. As they moved through the city, Jason couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. The streets, which had once been filled with the usual hustle and bustle of city life, were now eerily silent, broken only by the distant moans and shrieks of the undead. The air was thick with tension, and even the slightest noise made them all jump, fearing that they were about to be surrounded. "Do you hear that?" Maya whispered, her voice trembling. Jason stopped and listened. There it was, another moan, louder this time, followed by a chorus of others. He looked around, his heart racing. "We need to keep moving," Sarah said, urgency in her voice. But the sounds of the undead were growing closer. Jason's pulse quickened as the group sprinted down the alleyway. hoping to outrun the growing horde. They could hear the sound of feet shuffling, getting louder by the second. The zombies were closing in, and there was no place to hide. "We can't outrun them," Tony said, panting heavily. "We have to fight." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. There was no more time for hesitation. The group had to work together to survive. The undead were relentless, fast. They hunted in packs. And if they were going to make it out of Newark alive, they had to outsmart them. They had to be faster, smarter, and willing to do whatever it took to survive. And as the first of the as they made their way to the outskirts of Newark, the sounds of the city seemed to fade into the distance. They were moving into uncharted territory now, away from the chaos that had swallowed the heart of the city. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was following them, something much more dangerous than the zombies they had encountered so far. Tony, who had been leading the group, suddenly stopped. He held up his hand, signaling for everyone to stay quiet. Jason felt his heart rate pick up, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Sarah and Maya, who'd been walking close behind him, immediately dropped to a crouch, their eyes scanning the area around them. Tony's gaze was locked on something ahead. His eyes narrowed as he motioned for them to follow him. They moved silently, staying low as they approached a small, nondescript building on the edge of the town. It looked abandoned, its windows shattered, and its door hanging off its hinges. But there was something about it, something that made Jason's instincts scream that they should stay far away. Tony didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open, his hand steady despite the danger, and stepped inside. The others followed, one by one. Their footsteps muffled on the dust-covered floor. The room they entered was dim, lit only by the faint glow of sunlight filtering through the broken windows. Jason's eyes scanned the room, taking in the overturned furniture, the scattered papers, and the odd, lingering smell of something foul. They moved further into the building, and it didn't take long before Tony's sharp eyes caught something on the floor. Papers, stacks of them, strewn across the floor in a disorganized heap. Tony knelt down, picking up a few and scanning them quickly. His expression darkened as he read the first few lines, his fingers trembling. Jason stepped closer, sensing something was wrong. "What is it?" Jason asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Tony didn't answer immediately. He turned the papers over, revealing a series of documents that had clearly seen better days. They were stained, some of them half burned, but enough remained to make out the chilling details. Jason's eyes widened as he read over Tony's shoulder, his stomach tightening. The papers were filled with technical jargon, but the gist of it was clear. Experiments, tests, research. The kind of things you'd expect to find in a secret lab, hidden away from the public eye. As he read further, Jason began to piece together the horrifying truth. The outbreak, the one that had wiped out most of Newark and was threatening to spread across the country, wasn't some random accident. It wasn't some natural occurrence. "This is it," Tony said, his voice shaking. "This is where it all started." The words hit Jason like a punch to the gut. He had been trying to make sense of everything that had happened, trying to figure out how... Jason's mind raced as he scanned the papers, his eyes falling on the names of the researchers involved, the companies funding the experiments. He felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't just an outbreak. This wasn't just some virus. This was engineered. "The virus," Jason muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. It was all planned. Someone made this happen. He looked over at Sarah, who had been standing silently by his side, reading the papers with the same grim expression. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the weight of the realization hung between them. They had all known something wasn't right, but now they had the proof. The truth was darker than any of them could have imagined. Tony stood up, his hands trembling as he held the papers. "This is a weapon. A bioweapon. Someone intentionally unleashed it." Jason's stomach churned. But why? Why Newark? Tony didn't have an answer, but Jason's mind was already spinning. Ground Zero, Newark is where it all started. But there's no way it ends here. They wouldn't release something like this without a bigger plan. If they've infected Newark, they've probably got other cities lined up. We've got to stop it before it spreads beyond control. Maya, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice tight with fear. "We don't even know who they are. We don't know who's behind this or how many people are involved." Jason clenched his fists. "That's exactly what we need to figure out." The group stood in stunned silence for a moment, the weight of their discovery sinking in. They had been running, trying to escape the chaos. But now it was clear that the fight wasn't just about survival. It was about something much larger, something more sinister. This wasn't just about avoiding the infected. It was about finding out who had started this nightmare and stopping them before it was too late. Jason felt a rush of anger. He had seen too much. Too many people lost. Too many lives destroyed. To just let this go. He had to do something. They all did. His thoughts were interrupted by a low guttural noise from the back of the room. The group froze, their breath catching in their throats as they turned toward the sound. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and his eyes, those eyes, were empty, cold, dead. He was one of them. One of the infected. But there was something different about him. His movements were too controlled, too deliberate. This wasn't a mindless zombie. This wasn't a creature driven purely by hunger. The man's eyes flicked toward them, and for a brief moment, Jason could have sworn he saw something in those eyes, something that resembled understanding. But then the creature lunged, and the moment was gone. The group scattered, running for cover as the infected man barreled toward them, his movements swift and coordinated. He wasn't just a mindless killer. He was something worse. The venom hadn't just made them stronger. It had made them smarter. They were learning, adapting. Jason's heart pounded as he ducked behind a broken desk, his breath ragged in his chest. This wasn't just an outbreak anymore. It wasn't just about survival. It was about outsmarting them. And if they were going to get out of this alive, they were going to have to be a hell of a lot smarter than the things hunting them. The fight for survival was only just beginning. The truth was now painfully clear. Newark was beyond saving. The virus, the venom. He engineered Outbreak. It was all a part of something much bigger, a weaponized nightmare that had turned the city into a battlefield. The group had hoped to find answers to stop it, but now they knew what they had to do: escape. But even that was proving impossible. The streets of Newark were a war zone. What had started as random attacks, an explosion of violence from the infected, had turned into something more insidious. The undead weren't just mindless monsters anymore. They had evolved. They were organized. They were hunting. It was as if they were learning, adapting with each passing hour. They had coordinated attacks, driven by a strange intelligence that made them even more dangerous. No longer was it just a matter of running from one random zombie after another. Now, they were being stalked. Every step they took, every turn they made, felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. Jason could feel the poison coursing through him, the venom that had entered his body the night he was bitten by Mark. It was slow, insidious. At first, it had only been a dull ache, a throb in his arm. But now, as they moved deeper into the city, it felt like it was spreading faster, seeping into his bones, corrupting him from the inside out. His body was growing weaker by the minute. His thoughts were clouded. He could hear the blood in his veins as it pulsed, erratic and harsh. The group moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, dodging behind abandoned vehicles and buildings, trying to avoid detection. They had to keep moving. Every second they stayed in the open increased the chances of them being surrounded, of being caught by the undead horde. But the path ahead was getting more treacherous. The streets were littered with debris, broken glass, and overturned cars. And as they moved through the wreckage, Jason felt the weight of the venom in his veins. It was like a constant presence, pressing in on him, making his movements sluggish, his mind unfocused. He didn't know how much longer he could fight it, how much longer he could stay in control. Sarah, who had taken charge since they had first met, was the one who kept them moving forward. Her voice was always steady, calm, despite the chaos around them. But Jason could see the strain in her eyes. She was exhausted. They all were. Tony, the mechanic, had become quiet, his face grim as he worked to barricade their path with whatever scrap they could find. Maya, the school teacher, was doing her best to stay positive. But even she couldn't hide the fear that had crept into her eyes. They were all tired, and they all knew they were running out of time. Every so often, the sounds of footsteps would reach their ears, slow, deliberate, and then faster, accompanied by the low growls and guttural moans of the undead. It was a sound Jason would never forget, a sound that made his heart race every time it echoed in the empty streets, and every time he felt the venom inside him flare. It wasn't long before they reached a small alleyway that seemed to lead toward the outskirts of the city. The air was thick with smoke, and the distant rumble of gunfire echoed through the buildings. Jason's eyes darted back and forth, searching for movement. He could hear the shuffle of feet, the moaning of the infected growing closer. They were being tracked. They were being hunted. "We're almost there," Sarah said, her voice tight with urgency. "Keep moving." Jason's breath was coming faster now, his chest tightening with each inhale. He felt like he couldn't get enough air, like the weight of everything was pressing down on him. His legs were shaking, his body trembling from exhaustion, and his vision was starting to blur. He didn't know how much longer he could keep up. Suddenly, Tony's voice cut through the air, sharp and panicked. "We're not alone. There are too many." Jason turned to look behind them, his heart leaping into his throat. The alleyway they had entered had become a trap. From every direction, the undead were closing in. The sound of their moaning filled the air, like a chorus of death, their hands reaching out for them, their eyes glowing with hunger. They were surrounded. Jason's pulse pounded in his ears as he looked at his friends, realizing there was nowhere left to run. "We can't just give up," Sarah said, her voice unwavering, though Jason could see the fear behind her eyes. We fight until the end." But even as she spoke those words, Jason could feel himself fading. His body was no longer his own. The venom had taken hold of him more than he cared to admit, and the fight for survival was becoming a losing battle. He could feel his vision dimming, his strength ebbing away. The instinct to survive was still there, buried beneath the fog of the venom, but it was growing weaker, and he didn't know how much longer he could fight it. Sarah turned to him, her eyes locking onto his. "Jason, you have to hold on. We're almost there, just a little longer." Jason opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt tight, his body aching. He looked at his friends, at Sarah, at Tony, at Maya, and he knew they were all depending on him, but he was fading. He could feel it. The venom was pulling him under. It was only a matter of time before it consumed him completely. With one last surge of willpower, Jason forced himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, his body trembling. He stumbled forward, pushing through the haze in his mind, ignoring the growing urge to collapse. The undead were closing in, their hands grabbing for him, their jaws snapping, but he couldn't stop. Not yet.
He reached out, grabbing a nearby pipe, and swung it with all his remaining strength. The pipe connected with one of the zombies' skulls, crushing it with a sickening thud. Jason's heart raced as he swung again and again, the sound of impact and the splatter of blood ringing in his ears. His movements were slow, sluggish, but he kept going. He wasn't sure how long he fought, but it felt like hours. He was fading fast, his vision darkening, his strength nearly gone. But he kept fighting. He had to, for his friends, for his own humanity. Then, as if from a dream, he heard Sarah's voice. "Jason, get to the truck."
He turned his head and saw it. An old, beat-up pickup truck, parked just ahead, the engine running. Tony was already in the driver's seat, his hand outstretched, and Maya was climbing into the bed of the truck. Sarah was close behind, but she was still fighting off the undead, using her weapon with precise, deadly movements. Jason didn't think. He just ran. He staggered forward, his legs shaking, his vision blurring, and with one final push, he made it to the truck. Tony grabbed him, pulling him inside, just as a zombie lunged toward him. The truck lurched forward, speeding away from the chaos, but Jason couldn't feel the relief. The venom inside him had taken its toll. His body was no longer his own. As they drove through the abandoned streets of Newark, the city that had once been home to millions, Jason felt himself slipping away. He didn't want to turn into one of them. He didn't want to be consumed by the venom. But as the truck rumbled forward and Newark faded into the distance, Jason knew that no matter what, the fight for survival was far from over. As Jason watched the truck speed away into the distance, the small group of survivors, growing smaller and smaller with every passing second, a weight heavier than anything he had ever felt, pressed down on his chest. His heart pounded in his ears and his body trembled, each step a reminder that this was it. He was alone, completely and utterly alone. The venom had taken hold of him. The hunger was rising, gnawing at the back of his mind, making it difficult to focus. It wasn't just hunger. It was an insatiable, primal need. The need to feed, to consume, to give in to the monstrous instincts that were crawling beneath his skin, threatening to overwhelm him completely. He could feel the pull of it, like a dark void inside him, growing larger with each passing moment. His mind was slipping, becoming clouded, and Jason knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before he lost everything. The last shred of his humanity fought desperately to stay afloat. But it was no use. The venom coursing through his veins was too strong, too relentless. He could feel it taking over, turning him into something else, something monstrous, something that wasn't human anymore. He could feel his muscles twitching, his teeth aching as they shifted into something more suited for tearing into flesh. His eyes burned with a feverish intensity, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps as his vision blurred. It was happening. The transformation was complete. But in that moment, as he stood there on the desolate streets of Newark, with the city burning behind him, something inside Jason snapped. It wasn't just the hunger. It wasn't just the agony of the venom taking over his body. No, it was something deeper. It was the part of him that refused to give up. The part of him that refused to let go of everything he had once been. He looked up at the smoldering ruins of the city, the skyline now a silhouette against the fiery sky. Newark had once been full of life, of dreams, of people, and now it was a wasteland. The outbreak had claimed everything, the city, the people, even the very heart of the nation. The virus had consumed it all, turning every corner into a battleground, every building into a tomb. It was a place of death, and now it had claimed him as well. Jason's heart sank as he thought of his friends. Sarah, Tony, Maya. He had failed them. They had fought so hard to survive, to escape, and now they were gone, leaving him behind. He had tried to be the strong one, the one who could hold it together, but in the end, it was the venom that had won. The city had fallen, and with it, the last vestiges of Jason's hope. But just as he was about to surrender completely to the darkness within him, a surge of clarity jolted through his mind. It wasn't over. Not yet. He was still Jason. He was still human, even if only for a moment longer. The hunger inside him howled louder, but Jason's mind fought back, clawing its way to the surface. He could feel the last threads of his humanity struggling to stay intact. With a primal scream that tore through his chest, Jason collapsed to his knees, clutching his head in his hands as the hunger threatened to consume him whole. His vision went dark, and for a brief moment, he thought he might die right there on the cold, unforgiving streets of Newark. But then through the haze, he heard something faint, something that sounded like a voice. It was a memory, a voice from his past. It was his mother's voice, calling out to him, telling him to fight, telling him that he was stronger than the darkness inside him. For a split second, Jason felt something that wasn't the hunger, wasn't the venom. It was love. It was hope. It was the last thing that tethered him to the person he had been. But it wasn't enough. The venom surged through him like a tidal wave, drowning out the last remnants of his humanity. The world around him spun into oblivion, and Jason felt his body betray him, felt it twist and contort into something unrecognizable. He could feel the monster inside him waking, stretching, emerging. He fought it with everything he had left, but there was no stopping it. The venom had won. It was too late for him. Jason let out one final scream, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the empty streets of Newark. It was a scream of regret, of defeat. He had tried to fight, to hold on, but now there was nothing left. The city had claimed him, just as it had claimed everyone else. He was no longer Jason. He was something else, something dangerous. But even as the last shred of his consciousness slipped away, Jason knew one thing. The nightmare was far from over. The venom, the virus, it would spread beyond Newark. It would spread across the country, across the world. The outbreak wasn't just a disaster for a single city. It was the beginning of something much worse. A global pandemic. A new age of terror. And as Jason's body finally gave in, as he collapsed to the ground, the last vestiges of his humanity slipping away. He knew that the world would never be the same. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the burning skyline of Newark. And in that final moment, he realized that the virus, the Venom, had claimed everything. And now there was no escape, no way to stop it. The world would burn. And Jason's story, though over for him, was just beginning for everyone else. End.